So the plan is to go through some introductions, to go the background to the trial at Dave's, and then just a brief discussion about the plan for next year, and then we'll move on to Derrick's main bit of the evening, which is the Q&A that I've just spoken about. So Dave, you're unmuted, so that's excellent. So do you just want to give a bit of background to the people on the call?
Around why we're doing it and what
yourself and your farm.
Yeah, okay, so we are sort of northwest Norfolk. I came back to the family tenanted farm 3 years ago. We were running New Zealand Romneys, just rotating grass and clover lays around the arable. We're predominantly cropping, getting problems with summer dry. I should say, previous to me coming back, I was stock manager of a farm in New Zealand for a little while, in North Canterbury, and then coming back here, it sort of opened my eyes that there were some farms that were sort of outproducing us on probably sort of 2/3 of our rainfall, and using hardly any granular fertilizer. So kind of just trying to get the wheels in motions of trying to replicate some of that. And then there were some farmers like Doug Avery doing even better. So yeah, came back here, a few problems with summer drying off, finishing lambs, then having to get them onto crops in the autumn. And then, you know, we were finishing sort of 3 months later than we should do. And then making winter tighter and everything else. So got in contact with Derrick. He very kindly gave me lots of farms to go and visit. So I went on a little 2-week study tour. And Liz was on board already then. So we put, what did we put down? A little 7-hectare field. We lambed some ewe lambs, twin bearing ewe lambs on it. Yeah, I don't know how much detail you want to go
that's
into.
Perfect. No.
Yeah. Pause there for your slides. I don't know.
And then, Derrick, are you able to do just a little bit of background on yourself? Just working out where it could be me generating the noise.
Yeah, I can. Look, I've got a couple of slides at the beginning of my presentation that'll do that. But in short, I'm Professor of Plant Science at Lincoln University, and I lead the Dryland Pastures research team. So my main focus is working with sheep and beef farmers, rain-fed sheep and beef farmers. New Zealand, people's vision of New Zealand is ryegrass, white clover, dairy cows. I work with everybody else. So in brief, that's sort of what I do. And I'll cover off a wee bit of that at the beginning of my presentation, Liz.
Perfect, thank you. What we'll just do is, between myself and Dave, we'll just do a bit of an introduction to the trial we're doing here, and then just to give a bit of background to sort of where some of the questions are coming from that we've asked you. So this is the bit that, Dave, you was just starting to talk about. So this was the trial that you set up as part of this field lab this year. So you had this.
It was a little bit ad hoc. So we got the Lucerne drilled in the previous autumn. It's just opportunistic window. Established it, got some 2,4-DB on it in the autumn to control some of the sort of fat hen and stuff. So with transitioning, I was a bit sort of, just as to what we had a back run of grass, basically just left the gate open into a grass paddock that was next to it. And also the field next to was fodderby that had been lifted. So I gave them also, it was mainly for lambing, just to give them some more space. I just ran the fence and included that. So then once they'd finished lambing, I just tightened the whole thing up, shut the gate on the grass, brought the fence forward so they were just on the Lucerne. And then they had, 7 breaks.
So I've got pictures of the field from above.
There you go, yeah. So the field that was fodderby is now Lucerne. And we've chosen a slightly different, a variety with slightly different characteristics, just to, like less winter dormancy, just as a comparison, just to try and work out where we should be really. The variety that we've got, I think, is probably quite winter dormant. It's just interesting to see. Derrick probably tell us more, but how that will help with spring covers and lambing on them and things like that. And I'm not sure, but we might have to sacrifice some persistency, I guess, with that. But.
And then as part of the trial, so we compared that group of ewe lambs, and we compared it with, well, we'll look back.
It was all round. It wasn't really a very fair comparison, because we were comparing them with. I basically put all of our twin-bearing ewe lambs on it, just convenient size. If I was doing proper trial, I suppose I should have had a mixture of stock classes, so they could have a proper comparison across a mixture, same sort of mixture on our other grazing lays. But basically, we put all the twin-bearing ewe lambs on one, and then we then just mobbed into ages and multiples and singles. So it's just a sort of comparison roughly across the board.
Yeah, but the older sheep were on grass clovers with herbs, weren't they? So they were
grass, clover, plantain, chicory type lay. Yeah.
Okay. So, but in the first year was really to try and understand, to get you used to managing. So this was the first year in England that you'd managed stock on Lucerne. So it was part of that adventure as well, first year.
Yeah.
That's just a picture of sheep on Lucerne. So that's in that sort of, we were standing basically in paddock 5, weren't we? Looking, there's the tree, you can see in paddock 6, that's the view across. And then that's the sort of view of where your grass, clovers, herb type mixtures were. Obviously one's looking slightly brown in that photo, but so it's all relatively close by, similar land.
I should say we're very we're quite light soils, vary from sort of sand to sandy loam, but very high pH. We can see the sort of chalk lines all over there.
And we've got a poll just before Derrick starts. I'll launch a poll just to get some information in terms of what everybody's rainfall and soil types are. And then, so in the first years, as Dave said, it was an unfair comparison because we had the variation in terms of ewe age.
And it was a abnormally dry summer. So great to see its potential, that it didn't stop and all the grass was brown in sort of end of May, which we just wouldn't bank on. So yeah, it was extremes.
Yeah.
So normally our mixed age ewes would do better than that, but to see the our ewe lambs would not do as well as that normally.
So I think that's the challenge, isn't it? Which there's quite a lot of variables in the mix, but in terms of, so the growth rates for the mixed age ewes on grass, and they had some extended area and some supplementary feed added in, didn't they, as in the dry times?
Yeah.
So their growth rates was just under 300, and ewe lambs were similar. So you'd always expect ewe lambs to be dropped a bit, wouldn't you? But so they're reasonably similar, within 2 grams, I suppose.
But for twin bearing ewe lambs,
incredible.
Yeah.
There was a slight drop after weaning, but we'll talk about, there was some concerns about how stock performed on Lucerne after weaning, wasn't there? Which is a question for Derrick later on. And the other thing this showed beautifully was it did the ewe lambs extremely well in terms of their condition and weight.
Just as a note, the weights in that table are wrong. The mixed age ewes weight wasn't 52. That was weight so the 52 kilos is what the ewe lambs went on to.
That was my mistake.
The Lucerne weighing, and that's what the 63 kilos is what their average was coming off after raising lambs. So our mixed age ewes actually weaned in quite good condition, but just with poor lambs really, or not poor, but not fantastic. Yeah.
Sorry, that was my fault. I knew there was an error.
Yeah,
there.
The supplementary feeding came a bit later when we round off. It all just was a bit sort of all over the place, yeah.
So the key for that is that the lambs grew okay for twin ewe lambs, and the ewe lambs had lambed well. You were impressed by how they came off that crop. Okay, that's the rough summary of that. And then for some work for the field lab that we came up with some sort of production per hectare. So they really rough figures in terms of what that production was in terms of that includes weight loss or gain for ewes as well, but also land performance. So again, Lucerne's looking well just because of the increased land area that had to be given to those ewes grazing grass during
and the sheer
dry
stocking
summer.
rate on the Lucerne. Yeah.
So what I'll do now is I will just launch the polls. So there's 3 questions. One's about rainfall, one's about soil type, and one is about where you are in the country. So if you it shouldn't take many moments. Just if you want, hopefully it's come up on your screen just to answer those questions. Is that clickable? They're coming through now. Okay, so just the scores on the doors. So most people, well, 36% of people on the call are from the southeast of England. I'm sort of doing it in driest places first. Oh, it's changing slightly. So about 33% from southeast, so sort of the drier bit of Britain. Then the Midlands, which is almost the second driest, 20%. Also the southwest of England, northeast is. And then Wales and Scotland we also have representation from. We don't have anybody from the northeast, so we tend to be represented from the more dry bits of Britain. 60% of the people on the call have responded to say their average rainfall is less than 30 inches. Again, not that surprising as we are looking at Lucerne. The next highest, 20%, is rainfalls between 30 to 40 inches. And then in terms of soil types, I don't know, I'm sharing it now. In terms of soil types, the vast majority of people are on sandy loams or clay loams, with a few on light sandy soils and a few on clay soils. Okay, so that's, I don't know whether that helps, Derek, just to set the scene in terms of where we are. I'm also assuming that you know the UK soil type classifications, which might be a big ask, but yeah, generally there's a good proportion on lighter soils, but then a few heading towards clayer with soils with a bit more clay content. I'll stop sharing my screen, and then if you're happy to share yours.
I'm disabled from you.
Oh, here we go. Try that.
That look better?
Yep.
How does that look?
Ideal.
Can you see?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity of speaking with you, and I do have some familiarity with the UK. This is me here as a young graduate of Lincoln University here in the South Island, and starting out on my agronomy career going to change the world. And then I got married, and of course all that changed. But the thing about that is my wife was from Oxford. She was born in Oxford, so we visited the UK. And this is me standing outside the Farmer's Arms. So I spent a couple of years in the UK actually dealing with arable cropping. So I know the Norfolk area. I've been to Carrow Road. Sad experience, but I've been there. And so what I did there was I actually worked on climate change. So I was working on climate change in the UK about 25 years ago. And came home to New Zealand and said, well, if climate change is going to happen, who's going to be most affected by it? And for those that don't know New Zealand, the mountains basically run up through the middle of the country here. And anything on this west side is wet. And so these are our big dairying areas, the Waikato, Taranaki, Nelson, the West Coast. And anything on the east is in a rain shadow. And so that rain shadow means that we can have anywhere between 16 and sort of 35 inches of rainfall, or 400 to 800 mils. David was indicating he was farming in this region up here in North Canterbury, and I'm situated here in Lincoln, on the South Island. And this area here has predominantly become irrigated, and dairy farming has taken over this area. So my playground is really this part of the country here and right up through anything on the east coast of New Zealand. Now, those areas were going to be the most affected by climate change. And so 25 years ago, I thought, how do we change the farm systems and create more resilience for these farmers? And that was really the research question. Now, I never spoke about climate change to the farmers at that time because they weren't really attuned with the fact that it could be happening. So I just spoke about the fact that you have dry summers, variable rainfall, need to finish lambs quickly. And so the first thing I did was try and work out why they weren't using Lucerne, and I wanted to see how the crop grows. So I'm going to go through a section on how the crop grows and how we developed a grazing system around it. And perhaps at that point, if there's questions, people can ask me questions about the grazing management side of things. And then I've got a section on sort of animal health issues and how we deal with those, and then a section around the Lucerne grass mixes. So that might give us 3 stopping points as we go. Effectively, this is outside my office, and I had an experiment, a grazed experiment with Lucerne. And the first thing we found was that the plant, that it was irrigated, so the plant is responding to temperature, which is not unusual. So the warmer it is, the higher the growth rate of the Lucerne. But this was the key result. At the same temperature, in the autumn, it's not growing as fast as it is in the spring. And so this is irrigated, it's got nitrogen from nitrogen fixation. Basically, the plant is overproducing in the spring and then remobilizing in the autumn. So what that looks like under the ground is this, that below ground, there's about 3 tons of biomass in a spade spit. So I dig down to about a spade spit, 30 centimeters depth, and there's about 3 tons of biomass below ground. And the plant in the spring behaves like a deciduous tree. It takes the carbon and nitrogen that it had stored under the ground and it puts it above ground in response to the increasing day length. And because of that increasing day length, it then is growing more than we would expect from a crop just based on how much light it's intercepting and how efficiently it's using that. So it's a really big producer of feed in the spring. And that was what my growers were telling me. And they were saying, look, I take the first crop for hay because it's the heaviest crop that I get, and I take that for hay. But I was concerned that the fact they were taking it for hay meant they weren't actually grazing the crop. But if you're not grazing the crop, you're not getting the benefit of the crop early on. Once we get to, in our case, the longest day, so here we're talking about end of December coming into January, then the plant does the opposite. It actually remobilizes or puts sugar and nitrogen back under the ground. So again, if you think of a deciduous tree, poplar willow sort of thing, this is when it's turning yellow. And it's turning yellow because the plant is taking nitrogen and it's storing it in the trunk for next year. And so that's what deciduous trees are doing. And the Lucerne was operating in exactly the same way. So it said to us, how do we use this understanding of the plant to maximize its use in a farm system? Historically, we'd be cutting this, then we might get to weaning and we put a few lambs on it at a time when the plant's actually declining in its potential growth rate. So from that, this is what the plants looked like. This is 2 experiments here. This was, if I go back a step, the treatments here were actually grazing the crop every 42 days or grazing it every 28 days. So this was a short rotation and a long rotation. I don't use days as a criteria, but we just did for this experiment. And the difference in the plants was quite obvious. This plant that had had a good rest in the autumn had actually huge production potential the following spring. And I just make the point here that we actually killed this stand that we were cutting it every 28 days or grazing it every 28 days. We killed that in 2 years because we were effectively on top of it too often. And so we ran down its reserves. So that autumn period was really important for giving us some recharge. The other thing it showed us was that if we look at production from the Lucerne, given our spring is rain fed, if we had an old grass-based pasture, we were actually producing about 2.5, 3 tonnes of biomass, or 13 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per millimetre of available water. If you take David's good grass clover, then he might get 20 kilos of dry matter per hectare per millimetre of water because there's some nitrogen in the system. But the Lucerne, because it's never nitrogen deficient and because it's got that remobilisation, was actually producing 30 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per millimetre of water. So I suspect the first thing David found when he started managing Lucerne was that the crop got away on him. And I might be wrong, but you know, it probably took off and you didn't expect the explosion of feed that you got.
Yeah, even with that, the stocking rates couldn't keep on top of it, no.
Yeah, and so that's the key thing is understanding that and recognising the first thing that happened. So when you showed that photo of your ewes and lambs in the Lucerne, I'm sitting there going, yep, that had gotten away on them because it was sort of up to their bellies and, you know, well over. But anyway, that's why it's really quick to get away in the spring. So then we said, well, how do we design a grazing system to take advantage of this? Here is a high quality feed that doesn't need nitrogen, that wants to grow in the spring. That fits lactation really well. How can we maximize its use for lactation? So that's what we did. That first rotation is aided by root reserves, high quality vegetative forage. When I was a student, I was taught that we should wait for Lucerne to flower and we should wait for 10% flowering. And I actually grew Lucerne that was over a yard tall. So it was 70 centimetres. Sorry, it was 80 centimetres tall, so almost a yard. And it wasn't flowering. And I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. Why am I growing this huge crop? But that information had come from the US cut and carry systems and wasn't designed for a grazing system at all. So we actually get onto the Lucerne before it flowers, and when it's about, 10 centimetres or 5 to 6 inches tall in the spring. And we do that so that we don't run into the problem that paddock 6 is 60 centimetres tall by the time you get to it. So the other part is, David mentioned rotational grazing. Unlike a grass, Lucerne's growing point is at the top of the plant. So the growing point is that produces leaves. And for a grass, involved under deer browsing. So the grasses generally have their growing point below ground, so they're very happy to be set stocked. And you can remove the grass and you'll get a new leaf come up. That's not the same with Lucerne. If you look at a Lucerne plant, you can see the top of it is where the leaves are being produced. And so once we remove that with grazing, it has to recreate a set of stems from the crown at the bottom. So that's why we end up having to rotationally graze the Lucerne as opposed to set stocking. So here's some farmers in September, and this is on clay downs. So just to pick up, what we did is historically we would always grow Lucerne on free draining silt or sandy loam type soils. Here is clay, but it's clay that's on, in our case, north facing slopes. So our warm slopes, that would be your south facing slopes. And the water actually moves through this clay. So it gets saturated in the winter, but it moves across the clay and doesn't pond. If water ponds and sits for 2 or 3 weeks, then there's no oxygen around the roots, and the Lucerne doesn't like that. But this farmer had never grown Lucerne before, and this is clay downs, and the Lucerne is producing brilliantly. And they're sort of indicating the height at which they will start grazing. The manager on the left had been asked to start grazing Lucerne, and of course he got it wrong. The first thing he did was wait too long, and the first paddock he went on to was too tall, so the time he got to the 6th paddock, it was way out of control. So I was coming back and indicating how to graze that. where their hands are is where we would have ideally suggested they start. That's in 2011. I'd now say that where that lucerne is at the moment is about where we would start grazing in the spring. Okay? And this is actually an example of, we always say rotationally grazed, but this is a lightly set stocked lucerne paddock at Bon Avery. So there's about very lightly 5 to 6 ewes per hectare with twin lambs set stocked on this just over the sort of 3 week lambing period, and then they'll be boxed up and rotationally grazed around the lucerne. This is Fraser Avery. You were mentioning Bon Avery Farm, David, and he's sort of indicating, this is his ideal height for starting grazing lucerne in spring. The other thing we did is recognise that given a choice, animals would prefer to eat 70% legume and 30% grass. We often give them the opposite, and we're lucky if we give them 30% legume a lot of the time. But this opportunity here arose on some of these hillsides where we just cultivated sort of halfway up the hill and left the more shallow soil stuff here so the animals could actually come up and eat this if they wanted to. And this could either be a lucerne grass or a straight lucerne paddock. And so here you can see lambing happening, and they're making the choice to either move between the lucerne or the lucerne grass. And that's it's an early lambing, so that's the equivalent of if it's July, so that's December for you. So it's very early lambing period. But basically, just giving the animals that opportunity to go and eat if they wanted to. And then we get into the rotational grazing scenario, and you can see here this is about ideal height. So these lambs here are able to get a good feed, and my hands just automatically do this and say this is your ideal entry height. It's about 30 centimetres tall. That's about what you want to enter lucerne. And you can see that there was a 2-wire electric fence here. They've moved off this paddock or this split of the paddock and onto the split of the paddock here. And there's not much left behind because it's all high quality feed when it's about 30 centimetres tall. And why we're doing that, 30 centimetres in the spring is about 3 tonnes of biomass. And if you've got 3 tonnes of biomass, all of the leaf has an ME of 12. And if you're wanting to convert to digestibility, just multiply by 6.25. And so very high quality feed in the leaf, regardless of whether you've got 1 tonne or you've got 5 tonnes. The leaf stays very high quality. And the stem is about maintenance feed. So this is good for growth, this is maintenance. All that happens as you grow a taller crop above that 30 centimetres is you have about 2.5 tonnes of leaf and 0.5 tonne of stem at that height. When you grow 4 tonnes of biomass, you've still got 2.5 tonnes of leaf. And now you've got 1,500 kgs of stem. So David, I suspect you found as you got into the taller paddocks that they were leaving more stem behind, and there's a bit more residual.
It just got messier and messier as we went round, yeah.
Yeah, and that messiness for the plant is not a problem at all. It's simply that you've grown more feed. You're better off growing 2 crops of 3 tonnes or 2 30 centimetres than 1 60 centimetres. And that learning is probably the first thing that anyone who manages lucerne has to learn. And we're often a bit scared at the first paddock to go on because we're putting animals on. We're thinking, there's not much feed here, it's not doing much. And then all of a sudden it takes off. And that's that spring flush of growth that comes away. So we're trying to target farmers to have about, 30 centimetres of lucerne. We're not doing a days thing. In the spring, that could be somewhere around 28 days, 32 days as the return period back to a paddock. And then if we wean, we'll actually drop that even more because the weaned lambs are less likely to even eat that little bit of stem. They really need to be on sort of 25 centimetre lucerne to get the real advantage out of it. So, but ewes and lambs around that 30 centimetres, if you're a bit early or a bit late, doesn't matter, but that's the target. So this is post-grazing. There's some mixed grazing here. The cattle are in the paddocks as well. And here's just to give you an example, and I'm pleased you're recording, Liz, because if people want to go back through this, they might pick it up later. So this is our spring, and we've got ewes and lambs on Lucerne. And so we're starting the first paddock in the rotation at about 1,200 kgs of dry matter. And by the time we move to the second paddock, it's already got 2,200 kgs of dry matter. And then we get to the third paddock, which is around that ideal 3, 4, and 5, around that ideal 30 centimetres that I was talking about. But you can see even for us, paddock 6 has gotten to about 4 tonnes. So we've left, you know, there's going to be a little bit of residual here. And that's this line. This line is the post-grazing residual. And you can see from that first paddock, they've virtually eaten all of it, as they have for the second paddock and the third and fourth paddocks and even the fifth paddock. But by the sixth paddock, where we had 4 tonnes on entry, so about 40 centimetres, they've left behind around 1,500 kilograms of dry matter. And that's that it got messier that you were talking about, David. But that works pretty well, because what we actually, if we don't start this early enough, you can see that by the time we got back to paddock 1, it would have been way up here. So what we've always got to be doing is looking at trying to get as many paddocks to be grazed around this 3 tonne or 30 centimetre height as possible. And so paddock 1, 2, 3, 4, there's a bit of residual being left behind here because we're now in the middle of, you know, the grazing, the crop is growing really quickly. And then at the end of paddock 6, we weaned. And so these are then weaned lambs coming onto the Lucerne. And you can see just by the fact that they're weaned lambs, they've left more residual. So they're still eating around that 30 cent, you know, it's gone in about 30, 35 centimetres, but they're leaving more residual. And so ideally, we'd be bringing this down, and then we wouldn't have as much residual left behind, because the weaned lambs are not likely to eat as well as the ewes did. And then we're getting dry. So this is us getting dry in the summer. And so there's less feed as we enter into the paddock, but we've basically had paddock 1 has been eaten 1, 2, 3, 4 times in that spring summer period. So we've been able to graze that for 4 times. Then there's no feed. We've basically run out of water, and these animals have gone off to the works. And then in the autumn, with the little bit of regrowth we've had with some rain, we've actually come in with some hoggets, and those hoggets have just eaten the 1,500 kgs of dry matter that was available in those paddocks. So for us, we're actually trying to get animals growing 300 grams per head per day for 100 days. And if they do that, they put on 30 kilos, and they're out the gate sold at 17.5 kg to 20 kg carcass weight. So that's the target of the grazing of the Lucerne. The other thing I was really interested in your point, David, was the condition of your ewe lambs, because that's the biggest advantage to the Lucerne grazing. You often don't see huge live weight gain of the lambs, but you maintain the condition of the ewes. So it's hard to get, you know, 400 grams per head per day, but you can get 300 grams per head per day quite consistently, and you keep condition on the ewes. So the ewes are in good condition when they go to the ram, or you actually grow out your hoggets. For me, the hogget is the first lambing of an animal. So that's the real advantage, and you chose a good class of stock to put on your Lucerne at that point. Your mixed age ewes, singles, don't need to be eating this stuff. Unless they're cull ewes, that you're going to get rid of them, then you put them on and you can get rid of them quickly out of the paddock. So this is where we plant. So we avoid the hillsides. No point in trying to put it up here. We put it where the deep soils are in this case. They've got access to here. They can eat here and then wander up the hill. And I call this sort of landscape farming, taking where the soil is deeper and putting the Lucerne in there. This provides a bit of shelter around that lambing period. This is the high country. So this is cold. I'm talking here, this is Scotland's sort of Mackenzie country. Snow would normally be around here. They have about a 3-month growing season, and that's it. They only have about a 16-inch rainfall. So they've got a 120-day winter, 2 months of growth, and that's grazing in here. If we go through from the spring and the summer, where ewes and lambs or cattle or deer grazing the lucerne. Animals that go on lucerne should stay on lucerne, so they've got that gut adjustment working. And you're targeting sort of 5 to 6 paddock rotation with no more than about 10 days on a paddock. Preferably 5 to 7 days, but no more than 10. Because if you go more than 10, the new shoots have started to grow at the bottom of the plant, and they'll eat those ones out. And the allowance I've put there. So this is, these are lambs, and you can see for us, they're quite happy. That's the aim of those lambs is your housewife's Christmas table. So we have to grow them quick so that they're gone from here by the beginning of December on a boat, so they can be a leg of New Zealand lamb on a Christmas table in the UK shops. So and he would be making that no problem at all. I mean, it's hard to tell the ewe difference here when you look at them. These are Bonnie lambs, and they will have only eaten lucerne from the moment they dropped. And then in the autumn, we give it a bit of a rest. So that's that, let it recharge, that willow tree I was talking about. So we give it a bit of a rest in the autumn and build up those root reserves to increase stand persistence. So it might flower, it might not, but we're just giving it an extended period and recognising it's not as productive then. Actually, we're setting up next year. And because we've been able to get rid of the lambs and the ewes are in good condition, we've got less of a pinch on the feed on the rest of the property, so it's easier to let this plant have the rest at that point in time. And then in the winter, sort of one hard grazing to remove the aphids and a weed spray at that point. Your animals might be inside by here, I'm not sure, but that's just a one-off sort of for us. Sometime in June, we'd give it a clean-up grazing of any residual feed that happened. So that's grazing.
Sorry, Derrick. Sorry, I get an echo. The residual could be with ewes. So generally
Yes.
That's the sort of class of stock you'd be using.
Absolutely. So pregnant ewes would come in and they would just graze the paddock in a big mob for a day. Just take everything off, and that's done. And then the paddock is herbicide if required, but it's then left, because the key thing is the later I do that clean-up graze, the later the crop will be ready for me in spring.
Can we use glyphosate as the herbicide?
That's an interesting question. So it's not registered, and yes, you can, but you can kill the plant very easily if you do that. So let me take you through that. I wouldn't use glyphosate on a new stand. What glyphosate is doing is it's attaching to the sugars and going down, so giving you a good kill underground. Now, if you've got any leaf left on the lucerne, and at that time of the year, remember, it's operating like my willow tree and taking sugar down, you'll kill the lucerne. So we've used glyphosate, but we tend to use it, and there's some stuff in the New Zealand Grasslands Association, which is online from 2014 about using glyphosate. We'd normally use it on an older stand when we've got harder weeds. So if we've got dandelions and things that are much more difficult to kill, then we might go to something like glyphosate. Otherwise, we try and use either a spring herbicide or an atrazine, paraquat, gramoxone type of.
Yeah, I think we've lost all those here. Yeah, and we're just about to lose 2,4-DB as well, sadly.
Your consumers are, well, maybe with Brexit you'll get some of them back. Anyway, so basically what you're trying to do is you don't want to be using glyphosate when you've got leaf. So you have to have done a hard graze, so there's no leaf left on the lucerne. And then I've successfully used, say, 2 litres of 360 on the lucerne, on the hard to kill weeds. You may get a little bit of a drop in population, but what you really don't want is leaf on the lucerne when you spray, because it will translocate it down to the roots and you'll kill it out. So that's the other way to look at it is, once you've got the crop established, a lot of your weeds that in the first year will be fat hen and cropping, arable type cropping weeds. They're generally not an issue after that first year. They tend to take care of those. Grass weeds you can get specifically, if you want to get grass weeds, they should be relatively easy to take out of the paddock. And then there's a lot of chemistry available that you could use in the spring when it starts to warm up again if you needed to. So it depends on the weed spectrum as to what you do in terms of a weed control option.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the grazing, and I'm happy, Liz, maybe to stop there and take questions if people have got questions around grazing management.
There was a question came in earlier just for Dave, which was what was the date of the sowing of his? So he said autumn, it would have been autumn 18, but can you remember when it was sown and how did you manage it over its first
autumn 19, yeah.
Sorry, autumn 19.
Yeah, so we put in a sort of experimental rape and chicory lay just as to wean lambs onto. Flea beetle ate the rape out, so it was a July, yeah, late July. I know it's not ideal, it was just an opportunistic thing. With 2,4-DB, this is just me personally, from our limited experience, is probably spring sowing, just off soil temperature is probably best if you've got 2,4-DB, but with us, I think with losing that, we probably might try autumn just to limit the size of the fat hen gets, I don't know, Derrick might have something better to say.
Yeah, no, look, I don't get too concerned about fat hen. So you can possibly use a compound called Spinnaker, which I've forgotten what the active ingredient is, but Spinnaker plus 2,4-DB works really well. But actually, if the lucerne is establishing in the spring and it gets to about 6 inches, 15 centimetres, I just graze the paddock at that point. And if I graze it, just take that newly establishing crop, the fat hen will be left behind. I can just top the fat hen.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's a bit of diesel, but actually fat hen, unless it's getting all of the moisture, I've seen fat hen that's 3 foot high and the lucerne's 15 centimetres, and I'm thinking I've lost my lucerne stand. Once I cut the fat hen, it was fine. So I don't tend to use chemical control for fat hen. We either graze it or graze the lucerne once you can pull it out of the ground and it breaks so that it would be grazable rather than pull the seedlings out. Just go through and graze it and then top your paddocks after that grazing, and you've stunted your fat hen quite dramatically, and then let your lucerne come back and flower in that first establishment phase. So for establishment, I'd always try and let lucerne get to flowering. So, you know, you don't graze that first crop generally. The first one is let's get it established. So I'd be looking at that as a hay crop or a baleage, part of your baleage or silage options. And so if we plant in October, so what's that? That's 6 months later is sort of March. We probably would be waiting 3 months, taking that first crop when it's flowering, baleage, silage, and then it becomes part of our grazing rotation for a new stand. And the reason for that is that the lucerne is acting like an autumn crop when it's first establishing. It's prioritising putting stuff under the ground. And so you've got to give it that opportunity. Often you put a lucerne stand in and it gets to about 6 inches and you think, what's it doing? Nothing's happening. It's growing its roots at about 1 centimetre a day. It's prioritising sugar down. So it looks, and that's when it's vulnerable to those weeds that you're talking about with your fat hen, because it sort of feels like it's stopped. And it hasn't, it's just partitioning more down to the roots system. Okay.
There's a couple more questions. So one which is, someone's grazed their lucerne in the autumn and left quite a lot of stem. Is it at that point, do you top it or do you just let them die off?
You top it if you're worried about how the paddock looks and your wife or husband is concerned because it looks rough. But from a plant perspective, it makes no difference. Those stems will die off and your new shoots will come next spring. So it's not very good quality feed. That's when you could use a mob of ewes that you might force them a bit harder to go through and eat it. But from the plant's perspective, that little bit of stem might be that much left behind, will die off over the winter and not be a problem. And the topping, sometimes we've used the topping because it actually then drops those onto the ground, and it does actually provide a bit of a mulch. So it does do a wee bit of weed suppression from that topping, depending on how much stem is left behind, but it has actually provided a little bit of a mat to prevent the weeds coming through.
And then a similar question, another question which is on grazing cattle. I appreciate this is more sheep, but is grazing cattle similar grazing heights?
Yes. And so often with the cattle, we've put sheep and cattle together, but the cattle you can go slightly more. I'll move on to animal health because cattle are more likely to have some of the animal health issues that we're dealing with, and I've got some photos in here of cattle actually grazing Lucerne.
Just one more question before you go. In terms of varietal differences, I'm guessing in terms of, we mentioned dormancy is the biggest issue, isn't it? In terms of what's your preference for that winter dormancy?
So we use a semi-dormant. We use a 4 or a 5. Now I have dealt with the breeders from America who do full dormancy. All full dormancy is in the first year they look at the height of the crop, and so tall ones are considered to be winter active. But actually what that means is they haven't partitioned as much below ground, so you get a trade-off of persistence. They don't persist as long. So we've done a 5-year experiment here with a full dormancy 2, 5 and 10, and we put them under 3 cutting regimes. The full dormancy 10 was gone within 3 years. So if you've got the sort of clay soils that might be a risk and you might only get 3 or 4 years out of your Lucerne stand, in Australia that would be good because they've got lots of clay, it's flat, the water sits, high aluminium, sometimes low pH, horrible soils, but for them getting 2 or 3 years out of a Lucerne stand is great. So they would go for a winter active because that's all they're expecting the stand to last for. My farmers want between 7 and 10 years out of their stand, so they'd be looking for a 4 or a 5.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just move on. I'm conscious of time, but from a grazing perspective, to look at some of the animal health issues, and the ones we talk about often are red gut. Now, red gut happens, it's basically happening because the animals have got this very high quality feed, and so they don't develop as big a rumen, particularly if you put lambs on. And because they don't develop such a big rumen, it also means that the maintenance respiration requirement of that animal is lower because it's got a smaller rumen. So that's how you can get high live weight gain out of the animals, because they're not putting as much of their energy into that rumen. But it also means there's more space in the gut, and therefore you can get a twisting of the gut and red gut occurring. Bloat is more likely to happen on cattle than sheep, and we often use capsules. The other thing to be aware of is that sodium is deficient in Lucerne. So particularly ensuring that salt blocks are out for animals is important, or sometimes those weeds, and I showed you the paddocks where we've got a bit of grass on the side, that provides the opportunity for the animals to get salt. Lucerne stores sodium in its roots, so it's short of salt. So here's some fibre being put out. This is being grazed. The fibre's being put out for the animals to go and get it, particularly in that early spring period, and they're eating it as they want to. But this is the other technique that's being used, is about 48 hours before the animals go into a paddock, it's being mown. And this is particularly early in spring when the feed is really lush. And what you get with both cattle and sheep, particularly cattle, is they'll rip the leaf off and just get a really high quality diet. But that increases their risk of bloat, particularly when the Lucerne is lush in the early spring period. So here, the mowing, if you can get on the paddock, but the mowing here is basically just dropping that Lucerne, and the animals go in and they eat that. And they don't get the chance to select leaf over stem. They basically get the bit of stem that's in that paddock as well, and they're quite happy to go and eat that. So here we're using mixed grazing, cattle and sheep, and the cattle will be the priority here. So what will happen is this paddock will start to get eaten out, and in a few days' time, there'll be less to be eaten. The cattle will be shifted first so that they are always full, and then moved on to then get the first pick of the paddock that they're going to move on to. And so that's how the cattle are being grazed in Lucerne systems. Now, there are some farmers that are doing this very successfully. There are others that have done it once, had some animals blow, and said, that's it, I'm not grazing cattle on Lucerne again. But with all of these things, it's a learning process. You have to expect that when you start doing things, things will go wrong. And once you learn how to do it, then it becomes less of an issue. The other thing to be aware of is that it's a high quality feed, so your risk of clostridial bacteria problems become higher, and a lot of our farmers use a 10-in-1 vaccine, but it's just really important that your vaccination program is up to date, and there's always a risk here. The problem we have is that you put the animals, so they've got their pre-lambing vaccination, and then they're growing really fast, and you're not sure if you want to vaccinate the lambs, because if they're ewe lambs, you'll vaccinate them, but if you want to sell them, then maybe you don't want to vaccinate them. And then all of a sudden, the single male drops down dead, and it's generally been a clostridial bacteria. The cobalt issue, plants don't need cobalt, so cobalt is an animal trace element, so we routinely use vitamin B12 injections. Cobalt for legumes is partly in the nitrogen fixation process, but it's not really required by the plant, so you've got to make sure that you've got cobalt. A lot of New Zealand soils are deficient in cobalt, and so we would routinely use a B12 injection. A couple of other bits just to pick up on. In general, over time, you have less worm burden on animals that are grazing Lucerne, but if you've got some small areas around the edge of a paddock and they go and camp there, so your ewes and lambs have camped there, you can create this sort of haven of worms that you then put weaned lambs onto, and you wonder where all the worms came from. And I point that out as a potential because it happened to a couple of farmers, but generally we don't have an issue with that. The other main animal health thing to deal with is flushing. So putting animals on just before mating to try and lift their live weight. And one of the issues with that is that Lucerne can produce a phytoestrogen called cholesterol, and cholesterol can then make the animals think they're pregnant. So if you've got very humid conditions in the autumn and you get these sort of leaf spots on the leaves, you don't want to be putting animals onto that prior to mating. So you can grow your ewe lambs, but and your mixed age ewes, you can put them on Lucerne, that's fine, but you don't want to be on that prior to mating. So I had a PhD student do some work on it, and effectively, we know that if we increase the mating weight, we increase the fetuses that we get. So, increased mating weight, about 2% increase in lambing percentage as we put the kilos on. This is particularly important for those hoggets that we can get through and lamb the hoggets. But this leaf spot and actually the humid conditions that create the leaf spot means that cholesterol can spike quite quickly, and anything greater than about 25 milligrams per kilogram can cause a problem. So what she did was work out how long we had to be off the Lucerne before the ram went out. And effectively, if we were 2 weeks on grass, then we didn't have an issue. So the cholesterol makes the animal think that it's pregnant, so you decrease the ovulation rate, which decreases conception rate and therefore lambing percentage. But once they're pregnant, it doesn't cause abortion and it doesn't cause any post-mating problems. So you can go back onto the Lucerne if you wanted to afterwards. But just that period, and particularly because you're in all the situations, you're in a slightly moister environment than I am, I'd be aware that if you've got grass available, I'd probably have any ewes that you want to mate on grass for 2 weeks before the ram goes out. I think that's probably good from an animal health perspective. Liz, you've turned off, but if there are any questions around that, David, just
a small note from ours. Our biggest problem was photosensitivity in the lambs mainly. like sunburning ears, wool coming off on their backs. Yeah, I couldn't find a great deal of information on how I could sort of, prevent that, really.
And you won't, because there isn't a lot you can do to stop it except take animals off it. Or potentially that mowing could actually help, but it's the lush lucerne in the spring that causes that can cause that photosensitivity, and potentially getting onto it slightly earlier. But it occurs from time to time. It's not you've got it in the first year you've done it, but I wouldn't expect it would happen every year. I'd hope it wouldn't happen every year.
It was really bad going from a dry spell, good consistent growth. Lucerne slowed down a little bit, and then we had an inch of rain in one dose, and the lucerne went mad, and then that sort of became more of a problem.
That's that lush lucerne that become a bit of an issue. So, lush lucerne is something to keep an eye on. The other thing about that, one of your questions was around nitrate and nitrate poisoning. And yes, that situation that you just described is the other one where you could get a nitrate issue. So we had a really dry summer this year, and then we got about that inch of rain that you're talking about, and the lucerne flushed to about 6 inches, and that rainfall happened over about 2 days. It was still dull on the third day, and a farmer put his ewe lambs back onto the lucerne, and he had 100 of them die of nitrate. That's out of about 2,000, so the numbers are, but essentially it was dull overcast after rain. So you've got high soil nitrate, rapid uptake of the water by the lucerne, but the dull conditions mean that it hasn't got enough energy to convert the nitrate into protein. So if you've got a sunny day, there's enough energy to convert the nitrate into protein, and it's not so much of an issue. So it's those conditions you just described as being photosensitive are also likely to be the ones that could give you a nitrate issue.
Well, that might be a problem here, I guess. We're more likely to get those conditions through our summer. I mean, this summer has been very dry, but we seem to get rain events now or spells of weather. So that might be, I don't know. Yeah, it might be that we need to try mowing it or something to.
It's just a case of waiting until the sun comes back out. It's very transitional. So as soon as you get, if we've got nitrate in our brassica crops, we don't graze in the morning. We graze in the afternoon once the sun's come out, and but I know Norfolk can be quite dull for long periods of time. But generally in the summer you get some rainfall.
We're just talking about the weather to confirm, not to offend anybody from Norfolk.
Just the weather, Liz. Yeah, just the weather.
But that's a case of keeping them on the break they're on. So that's how you manage it, rather than removing them from the lucerne, just not moving them in those sort of lush conditions.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Just a question linked to photosensitization. Is there anything related to cobalt in that? Is it the cobalt levels increasing the risk, or is it not necessarily connected?
I can't answer that. I don't think so. I think it's a liver response. I'm not. I don't want to speak out of turn. I can't answer that. Sorry.
No worries. That's and then, and I think it's the sort of I think you'll come onto it in terms of that the bloat risk, especially when you're transitioning weaned lambs. Is there any? I suppose the guidance is similar, whatever age of animals there are, in terms of just a bloat risk on it.
Yes, the bloat risk tends to be less on the lambs, and that's where I'd be. It's hard to tell if I had a bloat issue or if I had a red gut issue with lambs, or is it clostridial? Because it looks the same. You go and see the animal and it's blown up and you call it bloat, but to truly be bloat, you'd have to have seen it before that happened. And often if it's sudden death, it's actually a clostridial problem. It's not a bloat problem. So that's a vaccination thing with lambs. Bloat in lambs is much less of an issue.
Yeah, we tried to do post-mortems on everything that we could, and we had a twisted gut and the rest looked clostridial.
So the clostridial is really important, and if you were on high quality feed at any point, that you've just got to make sure that your vaccination's up to date. And that farmer I showed you earlier that was putting his hands down with the first Lucerne, and when he should graze, he had clostridial problems in the first year that he did it. So he shifted to a 10-in-1 vaccine, and that's more expensive. And I think actually what he did, it wasn't the shift to the 10-in-1, it was just he was much more aware that I have to keep my vaccine up to date. Yeah. Losing one to red gut is, it sounds about right. That's a lot easier to prevent. The clostridial one is the one that will trip you up because you're not used to animals growing so quickly for such an extended period of time, and basically they just get overwhelmed. Their immune system becomes overwhelmed.
Okay, no, that's most of the only other one I suppose is you mentioned in terms of consistent growth rates. With that also, you'd experience that post weaning as well, or they generally do drop anyway, or is it still consistent?
The problem we had was they seemed to be the photosensitivity coincided with the timing of weaning, and they all just looked pretty upset about being on the Lucerne. It looked like they wanted a change. Slightly.
And I probably would give them that change.
Yeah, I did. I just took everything off. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't leave them on the Lucerne if you've got a photosensitivity issue. You need to put them on some grass or put them on something else for a while, and then they'll come right.
So should I then put a different group of lambs on it?
Yeah, I probably would. Yep. Yep. But ideally, it's the same ones that have been on, because that ewe lamb that developed a rumen grazing Lucerne. So you said you've got your young ewes, and then you put their lambs. Well, over time you want them to actually become really efficient at utilising Lucerne. So when you shift feeds, we all know there's a transition required to shift feed, and it takes a couple of weeks to get them transitioned onto fodder beet or transitioned onto a brassica or Lucerne or whatever. But if they're familiar with the Lucerne, then that transition becomes just 2 or 3 days, because their gut fauna is ready to deal with that pretty quickly. So their whole life becomes geared around grazing Lucerne.
Yeah.
And they become much more efficient at doing it. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. The next lot of questions are more to do with mixtures. Yeah, I'm sorry,
okay.
We are a bit over time.
So here's some examples of mixtures. So we have Lucerne grass sometimes. So this is used as a transition feed, the prairie grass in this case growing earlier in the spring. So that's being used as a transition feed to then go on to monocultures. And what we would do generally is you'd either establish this with, let's say, some prairie grass or a brome of some description, which is quite open and allows the Lucerne to grow, but also has a bit more winter activity than some of the other grasses. And the other thing about it is ryegrass is too competitive, so your Lucerne won't establish. We'd expect this to give us 2 or 3 years of transition feed, and then it would become grass dominant. As a Lucerne stand is running out, then we might actually drill an annual grass into it. So this is a Tama, it's just one of our annual Italian ryegrass types grown into the Lucerne, and there's a close-up of that being done. So that's an older Lucerne stand. It might be 7 or 8 years old, and the Italian ryegrass has been grown into it. And again, that can be used as a transition feed. So this is lambing, and that's actually an Italian ryegrass Lucerne paddock. So the majority of the stands on this farm are monocultures of Lucerne, but there are some established as a Lucerne prairie, and then some of the older stands for a year or two might be put in with an Italian ryegrass like this, and then used as that lambing feed. Now, it had been a mild winter, so the Italian ryegrass looks fantastic there, but that was, again, the animals probably stocked at about 6 per hectare, 5 or 6 per hectare through lambing, and then they'll be boxed up, and then they'll move on to a straight Lucerne stand. So that's the Lucerne grasses, and here is some cocksfoot that's been put with Lucerne, or cocksfoot for you guys. And the thing about the cocksfoot is was here because of a wind erosion issue, not really a growth issue. So we did an experiment at Lincoln where we compared straight lucerne. This is a Chituna, which is about a 5 full dormancy, and then a lucerne brome and a lucerne cocksfoot. And we looked at the production. So the animals were able to move around these paddocks. So they were constantly kept on the lucerne paddock. So that's the rotation, or they were kept on the lucerne grass mixes. And effectively, we had ewes and lambs and then weaned lambs, and then we run dry in the summer. So you can see that here. We've stocked, we've accumulated live weight, then we've destocked, and then the hoggets have come on at the end. So the graph is pretty similar, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of lucerne grass mixes. This is the lucerne brome, and you can see for the first 3 years, pretty much identical. This was a very dry year for us, but in the 4th year, we're starting to get less production out of the lucerne brome, and the same with the 5th year. And the brome grass or the prairie grass, we'd only expect to last for about 3 years anyway, and so they became weed dominant. And then that's lucerne cocksfoot, and the lucerne cocksfoot was as good as the lucerne in the 1st year, a little bit worse in the 2nd year, same in the 3rd year, not very good in the 4th year or in the 5th year. And the main reasons for that, I'm just shifting you guys around a bit so I can still see the graph. Effectively, the live weight gain of the animals, this is the lucerne brome, lucerne cocksfoot, was pretty good, 300 grams per head per day, stocked at about 14 ewes plus twins per hectare. 13, 14 was a really wet spring, and we got foot scald, and that caused us some problems. But then in years 3, 4 and 5, the lucerne clearly was doing better than the lucerne grass mixes in terms of average live weight gain. And that came through in the ewe live weight gain. So this is the ewe live weight, and you can see that in that 1st year, the ewes gained weight. In that bad year, they were actually milking. So they're milking to try and keep the lambs growing, but we're losing weight on the ewes. We lost less on the straight lucerne than we did on the lucerne grass. And here again, in these years, we lost less weight. In fact, we gained weight for the ewes on the lucerne, but not the lucerne grass. The lucerne grass ewes lost weight. So what you see with the lucerne grass mixes is not a lot of difference in the lamb growth rates, but it comes through in the condition of the ewes. And so overall, we found that the more lucerne we had in the paddocks on offer, the higher our net spring live weight production of live weight. So that's our total live weight. So the more lucerne we had, the more live weight production we got. Essentially, because in the first years, the first couple of years, these were, the green bars here are the lucerne. So they were pretty much lucerne dominant pastures. In the 3rd year, there's your lucerne, but your grass starting to become a bigger proportion. And in the 4th and 5th year, the grass and the brome dying out, so a whole lot of weed coming into that pasture. So it pretty much, the totals here reflect our variability of rainfall. So our spring can be 3 months, it can be 2 months, it can be 5 months, just based on the rainfall patterns that we get. So I'll just finish that I lead a fairly large research team here at Lincoln, a lot of postgrads, and these are my sponsors. So that's pretty much all I've got to share with you, but I'm happy to take questions. I'll stop sharing, and I'm happy to take questions that people might have on those.
So a question on that, which is, did you see fewer health issues with mixtures of grass or lucerne compared to straight lucerne?
Not really. We don't have a lot of health issues is probably the answer to that. So we didn't get any more because we don't actually get many on our straight lucerne because we've actually got the fibre, the salt, the mowing if we need it. So we haven't had terribly many problems anyway. But yes, there are growers that would suggest the lucerne grass mixes do give them less animal health issues, and also they use it strategically as that transition feed onto the monocultures. But a lot of them, the first thing I tell people to do is learn how to graze the lucerne, just as David was indicating, And then when you've got more lucerne and you're looking for area, then you move into the mixtures. Learning how to graze lucerne is by itself a skill, and it takes time to do it if you want to do it. So you're better off learning how to do that, because it'll give you some strict rules, and then you transition to using your lucerne grass mixes or in particular circumstances.
From a herbicide management and everything else, would it make sense to maybe drill your headlands with a grass mix to give them a sort of an option to choose, and then you could still use your herbicide to manage a monoculture?
Absolutely. And so that's why I showed you that sort of landscape farming. So we've sort of tried to tell people, look, you don't have to take every last millimetre of the paddock and put it all in lucerne. If there's a bit of stuff around the edges or something that's not so easy to cultivate, that's fine. That's providing some feed options for the animals to go and get it if they want it. And so they can move off to the grass areas if they want to. Yeah.
So in some of these situations, we can we don't necessarily have the hilly bits, but we can put an extended run back or something in to just help them in that situation.
Yes, you possibly could. I mean, I think you'd need to work out how that works best for you if you've got animal health issues. My first suggestion would be that you know, David said he lost some to Clostridial and one to a twisted gut. So the Clostridials are actually, you can take care of those if your vaccination program's right. One to red gut is, you know, not that many. And then I'd go, well, actually, do you need to have that grass option available to them? The early spring is the period when you're most likely to have animal health issues, when it's really lush.
I think I was possibly being greedy, wanting to take our carcass weights up a little bit. We're on dead weight contract and most of them go sort of 21, 22. So maybe if especially with the ewe lambs, was sort of 17 to 19, I then wouldn't be trying to hold them on it for longer and then getting those problems towards the end.
Yeah, and so I'm delighted that you've highlighted that. It's that last bit when your pre-lamb vaccination will have run out as you're pushing those animals to that higher weight. So that's what I said is the issue our farmers have is, do I vaccinate the lambs again, because I might have withholding periods and all sorts of things to worry about, or do I take the risk and push them through to that 21, 22 kg carcass weight?
If you were running adult ewes with triplets, would you still find that they would average 300 grams a day? Because if they did that, that would be pretty, you know, I could just use it for twin-bearing ewe lambs and adult triplets.
Yes. And triplets, you know, twins and triplets are generally the ones that are doing better on the lucerne, and the triplets in circumstances, so you probably wouldn't stock quite as high as you were. You were quite heavily stocked.
Yeah, and we needed more mouths really. We were 2 breaks behind it all the time. Yeah. Yeah,
so my answer to that is you were 2 breaks late in starting. So if you were slightly earlier, you know, maybe 2 weeks earlier to start, you might, yeah, that might have worked better for you. But yes, triplets, we would expect a similar sort of growth rates. In fact, some of the guys are finding that their twins and triplets are doing as well as the singles that are on the hills because they've got that high quality feed. Yep.
But with Dave's system of lambing on the lucerne and then setting the rotation once that lambing period had finished, what other things could he have done differently in terms of starting it earlier? I suppose it's to do with timing of lambing versus
probably have put shorter lambing periods on, so it was just a 10-day or you know, rattle them down to smaller periods. So then, because I had a 28-day lambing, on the whole, so I couldn't get them rotating until they had you know, properly mothered up and could be boxed into so if I did a 7 or 10-day block on each set stock for lambing, then I could mob them up quicker, I guess.
Yeah, you could. I mean, 28 days, it's a reasonable period. It's one cycle to have them out for. If it happens again, then you have to start looking at the lambing date. Now, often people think I've got to go later if I've got lucerne, but in fact, a number of our farmers have found they've had to lamb earlier because the lucerne has gotten away on them so quickly. So you've just, it's understanding what the feed supply is going to be from that lucerne. My suggestion would be, you only had 7 hectares, so it's not feasible to do. But if you had more, then one of those paddocks you would have dropped out of the rotation. You'd have said, I'm going to cut that, and I'm going to take that for baleage or silage or whatever.
And that was the problem I spoke to Liz about during, is what am I going to do with 1 hectare of...
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's a logistics problem at the moment, but if you double or triple your area of lucerne, then that becomes a much easier thing to do, because you're taking out a paddock, the 6th paddock in the rotation, and going, no, that's it. The other thing to do is you could keep your ewes and lambs going on the ideal, and you could potentially bring in another mob to go behind them, or if there's cattle available, you could bring some other class of stock in to be finishing up behind the ewes and lambs.
Yeah, I suppose you just bring in whatever's movable, I guess, some singles or anything, yeah.
Yeah, and so, but the target is then to try and keep the main mob that you're really concentrating on their live weight, that they're getting on at about 30 centimetres tall. And if it's getting away on you, then you still try and shift them, and you bring something else in to sacrifice a wee bit of their performance to clean up. But no more than about 10 days on that paddock from when the first stock went in to when the last stock go out. So you might have 4 or 5 days of your priority stock, they've shifted, and then 4 or 5 days of a second mob if they're getting away from you.
Tricky with just a hot wire between them.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely it is. And I'm not trying to downplay that at all. I'm simply indicating that as you get more, then there are more options available to you.
If it was a permanent stock fence and you could.
And that comes as you get confidence with it. So your experiment is the perfect thing to have done, to have learned what the potential is, and you'll find out again this coming spring. And then after that, you go, I'm going to do this or I'm not going to do this. And if you're going to do this, you'll start looking for more area to have more animals, and then your options increase. Yep.
Just a few more questions, and then so one which would lucerne benefit from any farmyard manure? So in terms of sort of organic materials going onto that crop, and when?
Yes, and so often farmyard manure has high potassium, and lucerne, particularly if it's cut and carried, it's actually potassium you're moving off, because it's got very high potassium levels. So putting effluent onto a lucerne paddock is generally not been a problem. Sometimes if it's too thick, it can cause some issues, but I would be trying it, and I'd probably try it after the first rotation in spring and see what happens, so that after I've grazed, that would be the time I'd be putting the manure on. I don't know how that fits in your timing, because we don't tend to we haven't got manure to deal with.
Yeah, okay.
But actively growing, if that manure is high potassium, high phosphorus, high nitrogen, the lucerne will stop fixing nitrogen and it'll use the nitrogen from the manure.
Yep.
So most legumes switch off if there's a source of soil nitrogen, and they'll use that. So I just see how it goes on a paddock rather than and learn how to do it. But I wouldn't say no.
Certainly,
we've got dairy farmers.
Certainly, if you're doing if you're mainly grazing it, you're not necessarily doing the off takes that you would need that
Correct.
FYM to go back onto. But if you've done a silage cut or hay cut, okay.
Correct. Yeah.
Another question, which is, we rarely see lucerne here lasting 9 to 10 years, as you've mentioned. Is that to do with our cutting management, or is it? What do you think drives your persistency levels in NZ?
Look, I think the persistence is due to weed burden and rainfall. So I'll get a 30-year stand in a 350 mil, so a 16-inch rainfall. But if I'm up at 1,000 mils or a 40-inch, then if I get 5 or 6 years, I'm very happy. And I think the extra moisture what's happening is you're constantly re-wetting the surface, so you're constantly creating a weed burden, and that's creating competition for the stands. Also, when the soil gets saturated, if the moisture's not moving, then it creates opportunity for fungal disease to get into the lucerne root. So,
Actually,
I wouldn't be...
drier areas would be better.
Drier, silt, sandy silt soils are the best for lucerne. But when I was a student, that's what I got told. So people only ever put it on gravel. And we have stones here that are riverbeds that we farm. But my argument is, look, 5 or 6 years of my lucerne on a clay soil is actually doing better than my grass pasture. It might not be as good as a beautiful silt loam soil that I've got 8, 9, 10 years, but it's certainly better than what I had there before, which for us could often be a brown top agrostis dominant grass pasture that's not really growing very much.
Okay, thank you. Last couple, which is one, so one person lambs in April. Would that mean then they wouldn't necessarily be able to keep on top of that spring growth? I think he's based in South Wales. I think that's it.
So I think he'd have to put the stand in and see what happens. So if you're lambing in April, it may be because it's colder and therefore the lucerne is going to start later. So it might be that actually that works pretty well. So
we lamb in April.
Okay, so it's a timing thing, and I think it's pretty much understanding that the plant is responding to air temperature because its growing point is above ground. So whenever the air temperature is above 5 degrees, it's producing it's trying to produce a new leaf, and then at some point it starts to elongate, and it's just understanding when that elongation is going to happen that becomes an issue. So I would think that I'd put a stand in and find out how it grows.
And just another one coming through, sorry. Can you sow lucerne directly after a worn out stand, or does it require a break?
That's a really good question. So if you go through the scientific literature, it will tell you that lucerne produces a chemical that inhibits other lucerne, it stops you doing that. And no one can find the chemical, but it's a thing called allelopathy. It's autoallelopathy. But my suggestion is that you go through 2 years of break before you go back in. I've never had any success of re-drilling lucerne back into lucerne. I have if I've had an establishment failure, or if I've had an area of a paddock that was flooded out in a particular year, and it was a 4-year-old stand, and I just drilled lucerne back into that part of the paddock that had gotten flooded out. But I've never had success at putting it into an established stand. The other reason is that over time, the lucerne plant population will decline. That's just a natural ecological process. So at some point when we graze it, we're creating bare ground that will allow weeds to come in. And so I sort of tell farmers to go through, a 2-year cleanup. That could be a crop, and often we're following it with a wheat crop or a barley crop, wheat crop or Italian ryegrass or something like that, to use that nitrogen. Because the lucerne has been fixing, like all legumes, about 30 kilograms of nitrogen per tonne of legume that you grow. Now, when you've got a grass, ryegrass, white clover pasture, if you grow 10 tonnes, you're lucky if you've got 30% of that. So that's 3 tonnes of legume, which would give you about 100 kilos of N. But that same 10 tonnes, and I'd suggest you probably grow 12, but let's say it's the same 10 tonnes, that 10 tonnes has fixed 300 kilos of nitrogen. And you've eaten it and urinated it. So you've actually put nitrogen into the soil, and you haven't had to provide nitrogen fertilizer, and that nitrogen can be utilised by, for example, that Italian ryegrass that we put through, or a following crop. So
you got any experience of people drilling say a winter wheat straight into a lucerne and then killing out the lucerne as a nitrogen flush, say in the spring or something?
No, I haven't, because we wouldn't do that. Wheat is a low value crop here in New Zealand, even though we can grow 17.4 tonnes of wheat. It's, that's the world record at the moment for a farmer just down south. That the land value means that that's actually not economic.
Right.
So wheat is for us a low value crop. So
do you see what I mean as a principle, as in using the
absolutely,
nitrogen
as a principle.
Yeah.
And I think there's two parts to that. Is I actually think that you might actually get 2 years of wheat.
Yeah.
Because the lucerne you've got the immediate nitrogen that's in the soil from the grazing and the urine and it being held up, but you've then got the breakdown of the roots and the organic matter that's lucerne based the following year. And so we would often see a flush of lucerne. Yet the difficulty you have is that you don't have control of the timing of that flush event. And that's always been the issue for organic growers trying to produce high quality wheat crops, is they'll put in a legume, but what they can't guarantee is that legume will give them nitrogen just at grain filling when they want to increase the protein content.
Mm.
And so, but I would imagine from that, for the tillering aspect of lucerne, of your wheat crop, I think it could, I think there's lots of potential and opportunity to try.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a few people, haven't we? We've found a few people trying it over here. So we just need to gather what they're up to. So yeah, the last question is on, so you've mentioned in terms of sort of root growth, which is incredibly impressive, but also carbon sequestration. So we love a bit of chat about carbon sequestration at the moment. And sometimes I can say it and sometimes I can't. So in terms of what is the level of sort of carbon that's going back into the soil from within a lucerne crop?
Yeah, so I tell my farmers to avoid that process if you can. We need to recognise that carbon sequestration is actually about, people talk about soil carbon. What they really mean is the carbon that's attached to the individual soil particles. That is carbon sequestration. Carbon that's going in as organic matter from a crop that you've turned over or a lucerne root is actually part of the organic matter, and that will break down and respire. So there's two separate parts to carbon in soil. There's the part that if you've got lots of clay mineral type particles, will attach to those clay particles, and that's technically what the soil scientists are talking about when they say carbon sequestration. What the lay people, the public, is thinking of is, I grow a big crop and I put the organic matter back into the soil and I've sequestered carbon, or I've grown the root of the plant and I've sequestered carbon. Yes, you have, but that will be temporary.
Yeah.
And it'll be temporary. Yeah. That's cycles. So as soon as you plough that paddock, you release that organic matter carbon. That goes. So they talk about a tree sequestering carbon. Yes, it is, but actually it's there until it dies or until we use it. It's a short-term sequestration. When you're talking about soil carbon levels, technically what the scientists are talking about is if you've had a history of cropping, you can increase the soil carbon sequestered onto those mineral particles until you get to a certain level. And to measure that change actually takes about 20 years. You can measure differences on organic matter and organic carbon, but that's not carbon sequestration.
Yep. As
a soil scientist would talk about carbon sequestration. Okay, so I just tell people to not go there, because all of a sudden someone will start saying, well, yeah, we'll pay you for the lucerne, but as soon as you plough and put the wheat crop in, you're going to be charged for the respiration that's occurring.
In terms of the benefit of Lucerne is organic matter, roots,
Yes.
depth,
So from a
organic
soil
Yes.
improvement
soil
point of view,
health
it's
perspective.
Absolutely, soil infiltration. Those roots, I've measured Lucerne roots down to 6 metres. So we
big hole.
routinely in our silt soils, we routinely measure to 2.5 metres. So what's that? 2.5 metres, 10 foot, or not quite, but 8 foot, no problem at all. And I have had one person ring me on a gravelly soil who was trying to take gravel for roading, and at the extension of his bucket on his front end loader, he was still getting Lucerne roots at the bottom of it, and he was asking how he could kill this bloody stuff because it was just causing him such an issue with the root. So the root can be phenomenal, and you're certainly getting below that traditional 30 centimetre, 50 centimetre zone that we talk about for a grass-based pasture. Yeah. So in that term, you are probably putting more carbon in total below ground, but I just wouldn't start making it as an argument to policy or anything like that. Feel good rather than promote.
Yep, and not have to pay the carbon credits back.
And not have to pay the carbon if you put your wheat crop in afterwards. Yep.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of the questions, apart from sandfoin, but I think that will open up a whole new debate. So we'll do sandfoin another night if that's okay. But thank you very much. It's been really useful, really interesting. I'm sorry we've gone over time, but we've still got a good number of people on the call. Lots of questions through. So brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dave. Hope everyone's enjoyed it. As I said, it has been recorded, and what I'll do is I'll send a link. It'll go on YouTube in a private section, so I can send you a link and everybody can watch it, but you can't necessarily search for it. That I found that's the easiest route to do it, as I've done things like this before. But if that's okay, but thanks again everybody, and have a good rest of the evening.
Liz, I'll just give you one final, is the New Zealand Grassland Association is where we publish a lot of our stuff, and it's open access. Okay, so basically I've got case studies in there of farmers that have switched to using Lucerne, and everything we do, some of it goes into journals that are hard to get, but we try and keep the stuff that's applied in the New Zealand Grasslands Association. So if you go onto their website, you can actually just search my name or search Lucerne, and you'll pick up a lot of papers and things in there that we've published.
There's a lot of reading out there.
Yeah.
And by a weird coincidence, it was the NZ Grassland Association meeting, wasn't it? Or has been today? Or was meant to be?
It's tonight, yes.
Because I had it in my diary because I was planning a trip, and so it still came up, and it depressed me slightly that I couldn't travel. So there you go. But yeah, I'll also circulate that link through, or link to the website.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
Bye everybody.
Cheers.
Thanks, Derek.
Thanks very much.